All right, you fuckers, strap in, because today we're diving headfirst into a real shithole.
Oh, God.
Syria.
Here we go.
Let's cut the crap.
Yeah.
This place has been a clusterfuck for longer than most of us have been alive, but most people wouldn't know the difference between Syria and their own assholes.
Right.
That's why we got our resident brainiac here ready to untangle this whole goddamn mess. By the end of this deep dive, you'll be able to call bullshit on anyone who tried to oversimplify this shitstorm, from your drunk uncle at Thanksgiving to those talking heads on TV.
Well, I'm always happy to try to separate fact from fiction.
Damn right you are. We're talking about a country where the capital, Damascus, is older than time itself. Seriously, the city has been around since before sliced bread before the wheel.
Oh, wow.
Before your grandma was a twinkle in her grandpa's eye.
Well, Damascus is considered one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, dating back to the 3rd millennium BC.
Jesus.
To put that into perspective, while Damascus was a bustling metropolis with complex trade networks and sophisticated governance structures,
What?
most of Europe was still in the Stone Age.
Mind-blowing, right?
Yeah.
And get this, the name Syria wasn't even originally used for the area.
Really?
It's a Greek thing, some bastardized version of Assyria, which was further east.
Huh.
Talk about identity theft on a historical scale.
It really highlights how names and identities evolve over time, reflecting the ebb and flow of political and cultural power.
Okay, enough with the big words. Let's rewind to the beginning, back when Aleppo and Damascus were the shit, while everyone else was still figuring out how to wipe their asses with leaves.
So we're talking about the Bronze Age, a time of empires and early writing systems. Aleppo and Damascus were major players, thriving urban centers that controlled key trade routes
Right.
and exerted considerable influence in the region.
So they had indoor plumbing and shit.
Well,
And kidding, but seriously, this was high-level civilization stuff, right?
absolutely. And their strategic location smack dab in the middle of all the action made them a prime target for every empire with a hard-on for conquest.
Yeah, the Hittites, Egyptians, Assyrians, those guys couldn't resist a good land grab.
Exactly.
They were all over Syria like a cheap suit.
The Silk Road also ran through Syria, adding to its allure and making it a prize worth fighting. For control of these trade routes meant wealth and power, and everyone wanted a piece of the pie.
So it was like a giant free-for-all with empires clashing swords and spilling blood for centuries.
Yeah.
How the hell did Syria even survive?
Resilience, the people and the culture adapted and endured, sometimes even thriving under foreign rule.
Interesting.
A great example is Julia Domna, a Syrian woman who became Roman empress in the 2nd century AD.
No shit.
She wasn't just some trophy wife either. Her family was powerful, connected to the priesthood of the god El-Gabal in Emesa, modern-day Homs.
A Syrian chick running the whole Roman Empire. That's badass.
Yeah.
Shows that even back then, Syrians were major players on the world stage.
It speaks volumes about the complexities of identity and cultural exchange in the ancient world. Julia Domna's Syrian heritage didn't hinder her rise to power. In fact, it likely contributed to her influence and reach within the Roman Empire.
All right, let's move on from togas and gladiators. What about religion in this melting pot? Was everyone just constantly at each other's throats?
Well, Syria's always been a crossroads of faiths. You had your ancient Canaanite religions, Mesopotamian influences, and then, of course, Christianity took root in Syria long before it spread to Europe.
Wait, so Jesus and his crew were hanging out in Syria before the Romans even gave a shit?
While Jesus himself didn't venture into Syria, his followers found fertile ground there.
Okay.
The region was part of the Roman Empire, and its proximity to Judea meant that early Christians could easily spread their message. Plus, Aramaic, the language spoken by Jesus, was widely spoken in Syria at the time.
So Syria was like the original Christian hotspot.
Yeah.
That's wild. And what about Islam? When did those guys show up?
The arrival of Islam in the 7th century AD had a profound impact on Syria. Arabic replaced Greek and Aramaic as the dominant language, and Damascus became the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, one of the most powerful Islamic empires in history.
So Damascus was like the New York City of the Islamic world, full of power, money, and probably a whole lot of sin.
You could say that it was a center of trade, scholarship, and culture, attracting people from all over the Islamic world. This is when Syria, as we understand it today, truly becomes Arab.
Okay, so we've got ancient empires, Romans, Christians, Muslims, and I bet the Crusades fucked things up too, right? Those guys loved a good holy war.
The Crusades, spanning from the late 11th to the late 13th centuries, were definitely a tumultuous period for Syria.
Yeah.
While they represent a relatively short chapter in Syria's long history, the Crusades exacerbated tensions between different religious groups, leaving behind a legacy of mistrust and conflict.
Thanks for nothing, Crusaders. You guys really know how to make a mess of things. Who was in charge after they finally got kicked out?
Several Islamic dynasties rose to prominence after the Crusades. You had the Ayyubids, founded by the legendary Saladin,
Right.
and then the Mamluks, who were badass enough to defeat the Mongols.
Wait, the Mamluks beat the Mongols? Those guys were like the Genghis Khan crew, the ultimate conquering machine.
The Mamluks were formidable warriors. They defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a pivotal moment in Islamic history that prevented the Mongols from further westward expansion.
So the Mamluks saved Syria from becoming a Mongolian barbecue.
Mm.
It's pretty damn impressive. They ruled for a while, right?
For a couple of centuries, until the Ottomans arrived on the scene, and believe it or not, things actually chilled out a bit under Ottoman rule.
Seriously, the Ottomans were like the OG bad guys in every history book I've ever read.
Their reputation is often exaggerated. They are pragmatic rulers who understood the importance of stability. They implemented the millet system, which allowed different religious communities to govern their own internal affairs. It wasn't perfect, but it was a damn sight better than the constant warfare that had come before.
Live and let live. That's surprisingly progressive for those times.
No.
So when did shit hit the fan again? I'm guessing the 20th century brought the usual dose of chaos.
You could say that the 20th century was a shit show for most of the world, and Syria got its fair share of chaos. The Ottoman Empire, already on life support, finally kicked the bucket during World War I, and those sneaky bastards, the British and the French, were waiting in the wings, ready to carve up the Middle East like a Thanksgiving turkey.
Exactly, the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Oh, yeah.
A secret pact between those two colonial powers essentially drew the lines on the map for much of the modern Middle East with little regard for the people who actually lived there.
Right.
And guess what? Syria ended up as a French mandate.
Of course.
So from the frying pan into the fire, I bet the Syrians weren't too thrilled about swapping one empire for another.
They weren't. There was a brief glimmer of hope in 1920.
Really?
When the Arab kingdom of Syria, led by Faisal I of the Hashemite family, declared independence.
Huh.
But the French weren't having any of that. They crushed the Syrian aspirations for self-rule at the Battle of Maysalun and imposed their mandate, tightening their grip on the region.
Classic colonial bullshit, promise freedom, deliver oppression. How long did the French fuck around in Syria?
They clung to power for over 2 decades, and their policies, particularly their divide and rule tactics, sowed the seeds for future instability.
Oh, great.
They pitted different ethnic and religious groups against each other, undermining any sense of national unity and setting the stage for the sectarian conflicts that would plague Syria later on.
Divide and conquer, the oldest trick in the book. So when did the French finally pack their bags and fuck off back to Europe?
Syria officially gained independence in 1946, but the road ahead was far from smooth.
I get that.
The country was plagued by political instability, too, and economic challenges.
It was like they traded one set of problems for another. What the hell happened where they just cursed?
It's complicated, but you can't ignore the impact of the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. Syria's defeat in that war contributed to a sense of national humiliation and fueled political extremism. Add to that a series of military coups, each promising stability but delivering more chaos, and you've got a recipe for disaster.
It's like they were trying to set a world record for coups. So amidst all this turmoil, who stepped in to save the day?
Entered the Ba'ath Party, a pan-Arab nationalist and socialist party that promised to restore Arab unity and pride, modernize Syria, and create a more equitable society.
Sounds familiar, right? A bunch of power-hungry assholes promising the moon and delivering a boot to the face.
Pretty much, they seized power in a coup in 1963 and quickly transformed Syria into a one-party state. They crushed any opposition, embarked on a program of nationalization and socialist economic policies with mixed results, and their rule was marked by authoritarianism, cronyism, and a cult of personality. It wasn't exactly the utopia they promised.
So who was the head honcho, the big kahuna of this Ba'ath Party paradise?
The Ba'ath Party was initially led by a collective leadership, but internal power struggles and purges were common. Then, in 1970, a military officer named Hafez al-Assad, a ruthless and ambitious figure, seized power in yet another coup. He consolidated his power by creating a vast security apparatus, crushing any dissent, and instilling fear in the population. He ruled with an iron fist for 3 decades, and his legacy continues to haunt Syria today.
Sounds like a real peach. Didn't he play the sectarian card, too? Something about Alawites?
Hafez al-Assad belonged to the Alawite sect, a minority religious group that's an offshoot of Shia Islam. He stacked the government and the military with fellow Alawites, creating a system that privileged a minority over the Sunni Muslim majority, further fueling resentment and instability.
So it was like a minority ruling over the majority. It's a surefire way to piss people off and lay the groundwork for a civil war, right?
Exactly, and that resentment simmered beneath the surface for years, occasionally erupting in uprisings like the one in Hama in 1982.
On the Hama massacre, wasn't that a particularly nasty episode?
It was a brutal crackdown. Thousands of civilians were killed by the regime's forces. It sent a clear message: challenge Assad's rule, and you'll pay the ultimate price.
So Assad was basically a brutal dictator who crushed anyone who dared to challenge his authority. What happened when he finally kicked the bucket? Did Syria get a chance to breathe?
When Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, his son Bashar al-Assad inherited the presidency. There were some initial hopes that Bashar, who had lived in the West and seemed more modern, might usher in reforms and a more open society.
So Syria was going to become a democracy overnight,
Yeah.
right? What happened?
Those hopes were quickly dashed. Bashar, despite his seemingly modern facade, proved to be just as authoritarian as his father. He maintained the repressive apparatus, silenced dissent, and continued the Alawite domination of the government.
Like father, like son, another Assad, another asshole, and then came the Arab Spring,
Right.
that whole wave of uprisings across the Middle East.
The Arab Spring, a series of pro-democracy protests that swept across the Middle East and North Africa in 2011, reached Syria in March of that year.
And I bet Bashar welcomed the protesters with open arms and offered to step down, right?
Hardly Bashar responded with brutal force. He unleashes security forces, snipers, and tanks on unarmed civilians, turning peaceful demonstrations into a bloodbath.
So he went full dictator on his own people.
Yeah.
That's when Syria went from bad to, holy fuck, this is a nightmare, right?
The regime's crackdown on the protests triggered a full-blown civil war. What started as peaceful demands for democracy and reform escalated into a bloody conflict, drawing in regional and international powers and turning Syria into the apocalyptic wasteland we see today.
And here we are, stuck with a country in ruins, millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead, and the whole world scratching its head wondering what the hell to do about it.
Yeah.
So let's break down this clusterfuck, Professor. Who are the key players in this shit show? What are their goals? And why should anyone give a damn?
The Syrian civil war is like a goddamn hydra. You cut off one head and two more grow back. It's a multi-sided conflict with a dizzying array of factions, militias, and foreign powers all vying for influence and control.
All right, so let's break it down. One twisted tentacle at a time. We've got the Syrian regime led by Bashar al-Assad clinging to power like a rabid honey badger who's got his back.
Well, he's got some powerful allies, including Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah.
Those guys.
They're all in for different reasons, but their goal is the same: to keep Assad in power and maintain their influence in the region.
So basically, a bunch of dictators and their cronies propping up another dictator. What about the other side? Who the hell are these rebels and what do they actually want?
The Syrian opposition is a mixed bag, a loose coalition of groups ranging from moderate pro-democracy forces to hardcore Islamist extremists.
Oh, boy.
They're united in their desire to overthrow Assad, but their visions for a post-Assad Syria are vastly different.
Sounds like a recipe for more chaos. And where does the U.S. fit into all of this? Aren't we supposed to be the good guys supporting democracy and freedom?
The U.S. has provided some support to certain rebel groups, but their involvement has been inconsistent and often contradictory. It's a messy situation, and frankly, the U.S. hasn't exactly covered itself in glory in Syria.
So, typical U.S. foreign policy. A half-assed attempt at regime change that ends up blowing up in everyone's faces.
That's one way to put it. And then you've got the Kurds, a stateless ethnic group that has carved out a semi-autonomous region in northeastern Syria.
Right.
They've been a key ally in the fight against ISIS.
Yeah.
But they've also got their own aspirations for independence, which pisses off Turkey big time.
The Kurds, everyone's favorite underdog. Until they start demanding their own country, then everyone gets nervous.
Exactly. Turkey views the Syrian Kurdish groups, particularly the YPG, as an extension of the PKK, a Kurdish separatist group that's been fighting a decades-long insurgency in Turkey. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place, fighting for their survival in Syria while facing threats from their neighbor to the north.
And let's not forget ISIS, the wild card in this whole mess. Those guys really know how to fuck things up.
ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, emerged from the chaos of the Syrian civil war. They seized control of large chunks of territory, imposed their brutal interpretation of Islamic law, and committed horrific atrocities that shocked the world.
Fuckers.
They've been largely defeated militarily, but the threat of their resurgence remains.
So we've got Assad and his cronies, a fractured opposition, the Kurds fighting for survival, ISIS lurking in the shadows, and foreign powers stirring the pot. It's a goddamn mess, and it's hard to see how anyone comes out of this looking good.
It's a tragedy, and the Syrian people are the ones paying the price. Over 500,000 people have been killed, millions more displaced, and the country's infrastructure has been reduced to rubble.
It's a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions, and it's easy to get lost in the geopolitical chess game and forget about the human beings caught in the crossfire.
That's why it's crucial to remember the individual stories, the families torn apart, the children traumatized, the lives destroyed. This isn't just a conflict playing out on a map, it's a living nightmare for millions of people.
Okay, enough doom and gloom. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the less discussed aspects of Syria. What about the oil, the water, the drugs?
Syria has significant oil reserves, which have become a factor in the conflict. Control of these oil fields is a strategic objective for both the regime and the opposition.
For sure.
And it's attracting external powers like vultures to a carcass.
So oil, the lifeblood of war and corruption. What about water? Isn't the Middle East a pretty dry place?
Water scarcity is a major issue in Syria, and the war has only exacerbated the problem. Droughts, damaged infrastructure, and displacement have created a water crisis that's contributing to instability and hindering any chance of recovery.
And drugs, what's the story there?
Syria has become a major hub for drug trafficking, particularly Gagnon, an amphetamine-type stimulant that's popular in the Middle East. The Assad regime is deeply involved in this illicit trade, which generates billions of dollars and helps finance their war machine.
So Assad's not just a dictator and a war criminal, he's also a drug kingpin. Charming.
It's a complex issue. The Gagnon trade has devastating consequences for Syria and its neighbors, fueling addiction, violence, and corruption. But it's also a symptom of a deeper problem: the lack of economic opportunities, the desperation of war, and the willingness of powerful actors to exploit the situation for their own gain.
All right, Professor, before we wrap up this deep dive into the Syrian abyss, let's talk about the latest developments. Those rebels have been making some serious moves, haven't they?
Things have been heating up in northwestern Syria. Rebel forces led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham have launched a major offensive, capturing the city of Aleppo and pushing towards other strategic areas.
And how's Assad reacting to this? Is he shitting his pants yet?
The Syrian regime, with Russian air support, is fighting back fiercely. They're bombarding rebel-held areas, causing significant civilian casualties and claiming it's all a strategic withdrawal. But the reality is Assad's grip on power is slipping, and the momentum is shifting in favor of the rebels.
So it's like a cornered rat lashing out in desperation. What's the international community doing about it?
The usual: expressing concern, calling for restraint, urging a negotiated settlement. But let's be real, their words are pretty meaningless at this point. Russia is backing Assad to the hilt, and no one seems willing to risk a direct confrontation with Putin.
So the Syrian people are on their own great, just fucking great.
It's a bleak situation, no doubt. But amidst all the chaos and bloodshed, there's a glimmer of hope. The Syrian people, despite enduring unimaginable suffering, haven't given up. They're still fighting for a better future, for a chance to rebuild their lives and their country.
It's hard to imagine what that future looks like after all the damage that's been done.
It will be a long and arduous process requiring massive international aid, political reconciliation, and a commitment to justice and accountability. It won't be easy, but it's not impossible. The key is to remember that Syria is more than just a war zone. It's a country with a rich history, a vibrant culture, and resilient people who deserve a chance to heal and rebuild.
Well, folks, there you have it, a crash course in Syrian history, politics, and the current clusterfuck that's tearing the country apart. We've tried to cut through the bullshit and give you the information you need to understand this complex and tragic situation.
The Syrian civil war is a microcosm of the world. We live in a place where history, culture, politics, and power collide in a messy and unpredictable way. It's a reminder that the quest for freedom and justice is often met with brutal repression, and that the consequences of our actions or our inactions can reverberate for generations.
So what's a takeaway for our listeners?
Stay informed, keep asking questions, and don't be afraid to challenge the narratives that are being peddled by those in power.
Don't let the talking heads on TV tell you what to think. Do your own research. Connect the dots and form your own conclusions, and most importantly, don't turn away from the suffering of the Syrian people. Their struggle is our struggle, and their fight for a better future should inspire us all to demand a more just and equitable world.
We might not have all the answers, but one thing's for sure: apathy is not an option. We owe it to the Syrian people and to ourselves to understand what's happening in Syria, to bear witness to their suffering, and to work towards a future where such tragedies are a thing of the past.
All right, folks, that's a wrap on the deep dive. Peace out, you magnificent bastards.